I'm Edward, and it's a pleasure to have you here with me for a while. Before the story unfolds, tell me, where are you listening from, and have you ever sent a letter to someone dear to your heart? Leave a note below, and subscribe if you'd like to keep these quiet mysteries as part of your routine. Now, let's step into tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. A Letter Without a Name. St. Mary Mead in late October wore its autumn colours with the same quiet dignity it brought to all the changing seasons. The chestnuts along the high street had turned to burnished copper, and the gardens, though past their summer glory, maintained an air of respectable order. It was a village that took pride in its continuities, in the regular rhythm of church bells on Sunday mornings, in the unfailing attendance at committee meetings, and in the gentle but thorough judgment of character that marked its social life. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her sitting room on an afternoon that threatened rain, observed the village through her window with the same practised eye she'd brought to such observations for more years than she cared to count. The postman had just departed, leaving behind the usual collection of circulars, a letter from a nephew, and one envelope that gave her pause. The envelope was of good quality paper, addressed in a careful, somewhat laboured hand to Miss J. Marple, St. Mary Mead. No street address, no return direction. The postmark was local. Miss Marple regarded it with the particular attention she reserved for things that presented themselves as ordinary, while suggesting they were not. She opened it with her ivory letter opener, unfolded the single sheet within, and read, "Dear Miss Marple, it has come to my attention that certain matters of concern within our village have gone unaddressed for some time. You are known to be a person of understanding and discretion. There are households held in high regard which perhaps ought not to be regarded quite so highly. The protection of reputation sometimes extends to those who do not deserve such protection, while others suffer from judgments made too readily. I write to you because you, more than most, understand how things truly are beneath their surfaces. Perhaps you might take note of certain circumstances that others choose not to see. I remain, with respect, unsigned." Miss Marple read the letter twice, then placed it carefully on the table beside her chair. She reached for her knitting, a pale grey wool that was destined to become a scarf, and her needles began their familiar rhythm while her mind pursued quite different patterns. An unsigned letter. How very interesting, and how very calculated in its vagueness. It accused no one of anything specific, yet it invited speculation. It flattered the recipient while attempting to enlist her authority. It suggested impropriety without the burden of stating what that impropriety might be. Miss Marple had seen such letters before, though not often. They were the weapons of those who wished to wound without accepting responsibility, to guide opinion without revealing their hand. The question, as always, was not merely who had written it, but why, and what they hoped to achieve. She considered the village as she knew it, which was to say thoroughly. St. Mary Mead was not large, and its principal figures were well established in her mind. There was Mrs. Constance Avery, for instance, a widow of some 68 years who had lived in the village for nearly 3 decades. Mrs. Avery occupied the Larches, a substantial house set back from the road, and she occupied an equally substantial position in village life. She was efficient, capable, and tireless in her work for various charities. Her committees ran smoothly, her charitable endeavours were well organised, and her manner, though occasionally firm, was generally considered benevolent. She had been widowed young, had managed her affairs admirably, and commanded respect through competence rather than warmth. Miss Marple had observed that Mrs. Avery was the sort of woman who knew what was best for everyone, and was usually quite correct, which made her influence all the more pervasive. Then there was Miss Beulah Price, who worked as assistant at the village library. Miss Price was in her early 40s, unmarried, and possessed of a quiet, conscientious manner that made her nearly invisible in most gatherings. She lived in modest rooms above the draper's shop, and had done so for 15 years. Her circumstances were not affluent, though neither were they desperate. She was one of those women whom the village regarded kindly but without particular interest, useful, pleasant, and socially vulnerable in the way that unmarried women of limited means so often were. Miss Marple had always found her sensible and well-read, with a dry humour that emerged only when she felt at ease. Mr. Harold Finch served as the village solicitor, a man of perhaps 55 whose reputation for caution was matched only by his reputation for discretion. He had handled the legal affairs of half the village at one time or another, and his office in the High Street was a place where confidences were kept and advice given with measured prudence. Mr. Finch was trusted because he never spoke of what he knew, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, such restraint was valued above almost any other quality. He was married, rather dully, to a woman who concerned herself with flower arrangements and little else. Mrs. Agnes Rowley was another widow, though of a different character entirely from Mrs. Avery. Mrs. Rowley was perhaps 60, had been widowed only 5 years, and lived in circumstances that required careful management. She occupied a small cottage near the church and supplemented her limited income with needlework done for the more prosperous households. She was anxious by nature, eager to please, and acutely conscious of her dependence on village goodwill. Miss Marple had noted that Mrs. Rowley worried constantly about what people might think, which was unfortunate, as such worry tended to draw exactly the sort of attention one hoped to avoid. These were the figures who came immediately to Miss Marple's mind as she considered the unsigned letter. The letter suggested that respectability was shielding impropriety, that judgments were being made unfairly, that someone deserving of protection was not receiving it while someone undeserving was. It was the sort of suggestion that, once made, could not be entirely dismissed. Seeds of doubt, Miss Marple reflected, required very little soil to take root. She set down her knitting and rose to prepare tea. The letter lay on the table, its words carefully chosen to reveal nothing while implying everything. By tomorrow, she suspected, knowledge of its existence would begin to spread. Such things always did, though one could never quite trace how. A word here, a meaningful look there, and soon the entire village would be aware that something had been said, even if no one knew quite what. The real question was what the letter's author hoped to accomplish. To damage someone's reputation? To draw attention to an actual wrong? Or something more subtle? To enlist Miss Marple herself as an instrument of judgment, lending her moral authority to conclusions already reached? Miss Marple poured her tea and returned to her chair. Outside, the threatened rain had begun, a soft, steady drizzle that would last through the evening. The village would be quiet tonight, with people staying indoors, but by tomorrow morning, at the shops and the lending library, at the post office and after church, the conversations would begin. She thought of Mrs. Avery's competent certainty, of Miss Price's vulnerable quietness, of Mrs. Rowley's anxious eagerness to please. She thought of how reputations were made and unmade in places like St. Mary Mead, how a whisper could become a judgment without ever rising to the level of accusation. "Dear me," she murmured to herself, reaching once more for her knitting. "How very unpleasant, and how very deliberate." The needles clicked softly in the quiet room, and Miss Marple's mind, beneath its gentle exterior, began the careful work of observation that would, in time, reveal what lay beneath this particular surface. For she had learned over many years that anonymous letters were never really about the accusations they made. They were about the person who wrote them, and what that person hoped to achieve by setting judgment in motion while remaining safely hidden from view. The rain continued to fall, and the village settled into its evening routines, unaware that a small poison had been introduced into its social fabric. A poison that would need to be identified and neutralized before it could spread too far. Chapter 2, Respectability at Tea. The knowledge that Miss Marple had received an unusual letter spread through St. Mary Mead in that particular way that information moves through small villages, without announcement, yet thoroughly. By the following afternoon, when Miss Marple attended the fortnightly meeting of the Village Welfare Committee at Mrs. Avery's house, the atmosphere carried a peculiar quality of restrained curiosity. The meeting was held, as always, in Mrs. Avery's drawing-room at the Larches. It was a handsome room, furnished with the sort of solid, well-maintained pieces that spoke of comfort without ostentation. The tea service was silver, the cups were good china, and the small sandwiches and cakes were arranged with the precision that characterized all of Mrs. Avery's undertakings. Present were Mrs. Avery herself, presiding with her usual capable efficiency, Miss Price, who served as secretary and kept the minutes in her neat, careful hand, Mrs. Rowley, who had been co-opted to assist with the Christmas charity drive, and 3 other ladies whose presence added weight to the proceedings, without contributing much in the way of original thought. Miss Marple, arriving precisely at 3 o'clock, noted immediately the heightened quality of attention directed toward her. Not obvious, of course, nothing in St. Mary Mead was ever obvious, but present nonetheless in the way Mrs. Avery's greeting was particularly warm, in the manner Miss Price's eyes flickered toward her, before quickly returning to her notebook, in how Mrs. Rowley's hands trembled slightly as she accepted her teacup. "So good of you to come, Miss Marple," Mrs. Avery said, pouring tea with practised ease. "I hope you've been keeping well. No unpleasant surprises, I trust." It was said with perfect innocence, yet Miss Marple was not deceived. The question hung in the air with more weight than its words suggested. "Quite well, thank you, Mrs. Avery," Miss Marple replied, accepting her cup. "Though one does receive the occasional unexpected correspondence, of course. The post brings all manner of things these days." There was the smallest pause, barely perceptible, before Mrs. Avery smiled and said, "Indeed. Though I've always felt that anything truly important is best said directly, don't you think? Anonymous communications are so very unsatisfactory. They create uncertainty where clarity would serve better." "Anonymous?" asked Mrs. Simmons, one of the other committee members, with the eager interest of someone who's caught the scent of something interesting. "Oh, I speak only generally," Mrs. Avery said smoothly. "One hears of such things from time to time. People who write letters without signing them, spreading suggestions rather than facts. I've always thought it rather cowardly myself. If one has something to say, one ought to have the courage to say it openly." "Quite right," murmured Mrs. Rowley, her voice soft and anxious. "One should never listen to anonymous letters. They're always meant to cause trouble, aren't they? To make people suspicious of one another." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Rowley's colour was high, and her manner more nervous than usual. The woman's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "such letters reveal more about their authors than about their subjects. The impulse to write without signing one's name suggests a desire to influence events while avoiding responsibility for that influence." "Very wise, Miss Marple," Mrs. Avery said warmly. "That is precisely the sort of balanced judgment one appreciates. In a village like ours, where we all know one another so well, it's essential that we maintain trust and discretion. Hasty judgments based on whispers can do such harm." She spoke with such evident sincerity that Miss Marple found herself reconsidering her initial impressions. Mrs. Avery sounded genuinely concerned about the damage that unfounded gossip might cause. Yet there was something in her manner, a hint of too much concern perhaps, or concern directed too purposefully, that gave Miss Marple pause. Miss Price had remained silent throughout this exchange, her pen poised over her notebook, though the meeting had not yet properly begun. She was paler than usual, and her shoulders carried a tension that had not been there at the previous meeting. "Shall we proceed to the agenda?" Miss Price asked quietly. "We have the Christmas arrangements to finalise." "Of course, my dear," Mrs. Avery said, her tone kind. "Though I should mention, and I hope you won't take this amiss, Miss Price, that I've been thinking we might benefit from reorganising some of our committee responsibilities. Nothing dramatic, you understand, simply ensuring that everyone's talents are used most effectively." Miss Price's pen stopped moving. "I see," she said after a moment. "Have my minutes been unsatisfactory in some way?" "Not at all, not at all," Mrs. Avery assured her. "Your work is always most conscientious. I merely thought that with the Christmas drive expanding this year, we might need someone with a bit more, well, flexibility in their schedule. Someone who could take on additional tasks at short notice." It was said with such apparent consideration that any objection would have seemed ungracious. Yet Miss Marple noted that what was being offered as practical reorganisation was, In effect, a reduction in Miss Price's role. The position of secretary was a small thing, certainly, but in a village where social standing was measured in such increments, it was not nothing. "I understand," Miss Price said, her voice carefully neutral. "Whatever the committee thinks best." "That's very understanding of you," Mrs. Avery said warmly. "I knew you'd see the sense in it. Now, about the Christmas hampers." The meeting proceeded with discussions of charitable distributions, arrangements for the village Christmas tree, and various other seasonal matters. Throughout it all, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics at play. Mrs. Avery spoke of kindness and generosity, of the importance of helping those in need, and maintaining the village's traditions of charity. Her words were unimpeachable, her sentiments beyond reproach. Yet there was a quality to her manner when addressing Miss Price, a gentle but unmistakable condescension, that suggested the kindness was more performance than genuine warmth. Mrs. Rowley contributed little to the discussion, agreeing readily with whatever Mrs. Avery proposed, and casting occasional worried glances around the room, as though expecting criticism. When Mrs. Avery praised her needlework for the Christmas sale, the compliment seemed to both please and unsettle her. "You're too kind, Mrs. Avery," Mrs. Rowley murmured. "I only hope my contributions are adequate. One tries one's best, but there's always the worry that one's efforts might not measure up." "Nonsense, my dear," Mrs. Avery said firmly. "Your work is perfectly acceptable. I've always said that what matters is the intention behind the effort, not merely the result, and your intentions are entirely admirable." It was meant as reassurance, Miss Marple supposed, yet there was something in the phrasing, perfectly acceptable rather than good, admirable intentions rather than admirable work, that suggested a hierarchy being gently maintained. When the meeting concluded and the ladies prepared to depart, Miss Marple found herself walking a short distance with Miss Price, who had gathered her papers with particular care and seemed in no hurry to engage in conversation. "The autumn weather has been rather fine," Miss Marple ventured. "Good for walking, I find, when one needs to clear one's thoughts." Miss Price glanced at her, something flickering in her expression before being carefully suppressed. "Yes," she said quietly. "I've been walking rather more than usual lately. It's easier than being indoors sometimes, wondering what people are thinking." "Wondering what people are thinking," Miss Marple repeated gently, "is often more painful than knowing what they actually think. Imagination, I've found, tends to be harsher than reality." "Perhaps," Miss Price said. "Or perhaps reality is exactly as harsh as one imagines, only expressed too politely to be openly acknowledged." She bid Miss Marple good afternoon and walked away with swift, determined steps, leaving Miss Marple standing at the corner considering what had just been revealed. Mrs. Avery's respectability was impeccable. Her charity work was genuine. Her concern for the village's welfare seemed sincere. Yet beneath it all, Miss Marple detected something else, a pattern of careful management, of judgments made and influence exerted, always with kindness on the surface and control underneath. And Miss Price, it seemed, had already begun to suffer from whatever the anonymous letter had set in motion. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, watching the younger woman's retreating figure. "How very subtle, and how very cruel." She turned toward home, her mind occupied with the question of how reputations were maintained and undermined in places like St. Mary Mead, not through open accusation, but through the careful adjustment of social standing, expressed always with the utmost courtesy and concern. Chapter 3, What Was Not Repeated. Miss Marple had long since learned that the most revealing conversations in a village were not those that took place at formal gatherings, but rather the small exchanges that occurred in shops, on street corners, and over garden fences. It was in these unguarded moments that people revealed what they truly thought, as opposed to what they wished to be thought to think. The days following the committee meeting provided ample opportunity for such observations. On Thursday morning, Miss Marple visited the lending library, ostensibly to return a volume of essays that had proven less engaging than anticipated. The library occupied a room above the chemist's shop, reached by a narrow staircase that required careful navigation. Miss Price was there, as she always was on Thursday mornings, cataloguing new acquisitions with her characteristic attention to detail. "Good morning, Miss Price," Miss Marple said, placing her book on the counter. "I'm afraid I found Professor Henderson's thoughts on modern education rather less illuminating than I'd hoped. Perhaps you might recommend something more substantial." Miss Price looked up from her work, and Miss Marple noted that she appeared tired, with shadows beneath her eyes that suggested inadequate sleep. "Of course, Miss Marple. We've just received Mrs. Gaskell's North and South in a new edition. I think you'd find it rewarding. The social observations are quite penetrating." "How kind. You always know exactly what will suit." Miss Marple paused, then added gently, "I do hope you're not working too hard, my dear. You look rather pale." Miss Price's smile was brief and did not reach her eyes. "I'm quite well, thank you. Simply rather busy at present. There's been some reorganization of my responsibilities, which requires adjustment." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced another arrival. Mrs. Simmons entered, accompanied by her married daughter, both clearly intent on selecting something for the weekend. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Simmons said, with a sort of excessive warmth that usually preceded an attempt to extract information. "And Miss Price, of course. How industrious you are, always working away up here." "Good morning," Miss Price said quietly, returning to her cataloguing with what appeared to be deliberate focus. Mrs. Simmons moved about the library with her daughter, their voices carrying clearly in the small space. They discussed various titles, the weather, the approaching Christmas season. Then, as they moved toward the fiction shelves, Miss Marple heard Mrs. Simmons say in a lowered voice that nonetheless carried perfectly well, "Of course, dear Mrs. Avery was saying only yesterday how important it is to have truly reliable people in positions of responsibility. One must be so careful about whom one trusts with important tasks." "Mrs. Avery is always so thoughtful," her daughter replied dutifully. "Indeed she is. Such judgment, such discretion. She knows exactly who can be relied upon and who might be better suited to lesser roles." Miss Marple, ostensibly absorbed in examining the new Mrs. Gaskell volume, observed Miss Price's shoulders stiffen slightly. The younger woman's pen continued moving across her catalogue cards, but her hand had developed a faint tremor. "I'll take this one, I think," Miss Marple said, bringing the book to the counter. "It will do admirably." Miss Price recorded the loan with mechanical precision, her face carefully composed. Only when Mrs. Simmons and her daughter had departed, their selections made and their conversation continuing down the stairs, did she allow herself to speak. "They believe I cannot hear them," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Or perhaps they believe I should hear them. I'm never quite certain which is worse." "Neither is pleasant," Miss Marple agreed, "though I've found that what people say in one's presence often matters less than what they say in one's absence." "Yes," Miss Price's voice was very soft. "That's rather the difficulty, isn't it? One never knows what is being said, only that something is." Miss Marple took her book and departed, troubled by what she had witnessed. The cruelty had been exquisite in its deniability. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be challenged, simply an observation about reliability and trust made within Miss Price's hearing, while pretending it had no specific application. That afternoon, while taking tea at the Blue Boar, the village's modest hotel, which served a respectable if uninspired tea, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Finch, the solicitor, who was concluding a meeting with a client in one of the private sitting rooms. He emerged just as Miss Marple was settling at a corner table, and courtesy required that they acknowledge one another. "Miss Marple, good afternoon. May I join you briefly? I've just concluded some rather tedious business and could use the fortification of tea." "By all means, Mr. Finch." The solicitor seated himself with the careful movements of a man conscious of his dignity. He was one of those people, Miss Marple had long since observed, who measured their words as carefully as they measured everything else. "I trust you're keeping well?" he inquired, signalling to the waitress. "Quite well, thank you, and yourself?" "Well enough, well enough. Though one does worry about the village sometimes. Small communities are so very delicate in their social arrangements." Miss Marple waited, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, She had learned that lawyers, like many professional men, enjoyed the sound of their own voices and would eventually arrive at their point given sufficient silence in which to do so. "I was speaking with Mrs. Avery yesterday," Mr. Finch continued once his tea had been brought. "We were discussing the various charitable committees and their compositions. Mrs. Avery has such a gift for organising things, don't you think? She understands people, understands what they're capable of and what might be beyond their capacities." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Take Miss Price, for instance. Perfectly adequate for routine library work, of course. Conscientious, punctual, but perhaps not quite suited to positions requiring broader judgment or social confidence. Mrs. Avery was saying that sometimes one must make difficult decisions for the greater good, removing someone from a role not because they've done anything wrong precisely, but because it's simply better that way." "Better for whom?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Finch looked momentarily nonplussed. "For everyone, naturally. For the person themselves, as much as anyone. Being placed in situations for which one is not quite suited can be most uncomfortable. Far kinder to recognise limitations early and adjust accordingly." "I see. And has Miss Price been found wanting in her duties?" "Oh, nothing specific." Mr. Finch waved a dismissive hand. "Simply a general sense that perhaps she's not quite reliable in ways that matter. One hears things, you understand. Not accusations precisely, but impressions. And in village life, impressions matter a great deal." "What sort of things does one hear?" Miss Marple inquired, her voice mild. Mr. Finch shifted slightly in his chair. "Nothing I could put my finger on, you understand. Simply a sense that there might be irregularities of judgment, a tendency toward unreliability that hasn't yet manifested in any obvious way, but which prudent people would do well to anticipate." Miss Marple regarded him with the same expression she might have given to a child explaining why the jam tart had disappeared, while maintaining sticky fingers behind his back. "How very convenient," she observed, "to have suspicions that require no supporting evidence yet serve to justify exclusion nonetheless." Mr. Finch coloured slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Mrs. Avery has only the best interest of the village at heart. If she has concerns about someone's suitability, those concerns are doubtless well-founded." "Are they?" Miss Marple asked. "I've always found that concerns based on nothing specific tend to reveal more about the person harbouring them than about their ostensible object." The solicitor finished his tea with rather more haste than was comfortable and excused himself, with a vague mention of pressing business. Miss Marple watched him depart, noting the stiffness in his shoulders that suggested discomfort with the conversation's conclusion. She sat alone with her cooling tea, considering what she had learned. In Miss Price's presence, people spoke of reliability and trust with pointed generality. In her absence, they spoke of her directly but with equal vagueness, unreliable, unsuitable, limited in judgment, without ever providing specific cause for such assessments. And Mrs. Avery, it seemed, was the source from which these impressions flowed, always expressed with concern, always framed as regrettable necessity, and always effective in their damage precisely because they offered nothing concrete to refute. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, rising to leave, "how very thorough, and how very unjust." She walked home through the October twilight, reflecting that polite cruelty was perhaps the most insidious form of all, for it cloaked itself in kindness and refused to answer for its consequences. Chapter 4, Polite Distances. The first Saturday in November arrived with the sort of crisp, clear weather that made walking a pleasure rather than a duty. Miss Marple had formed the habit of taking a constitutional after breakfast, and on this particular morning her route led her past the churchyard and along the lane that bordered the vicarage garden. She was not entirely surprised to encounter Miss Price coming from the opposite direction, though the younger woman's presence on this particular path at this particular hour suggested a deliberate choice rather than coincidence. Miss Price had the look of someone who had been walking for some time, and her expression carried a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "Good morning, Miss Price," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "A lovely morning for exercise." "Good morning, Miss Marple." Miss Price hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. I wonder, that is, if you're not in a hurry, might I walk with you a short way? There's something I'd like to discuss if you wouldn't mind. Not at all, my dear. I should be glad of the company. They walked in silence for a few moments, Miss Price evidently gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as though they had been held back too long and could no longer be contained. I've been excluded from the Village Welfare Committee, she said. Mrs. Avery informed me yesterday afternoon, quite kindly, that she felt it would be best if I stepped down from all my responsibilities. Not just the secretary position, which I'd already understood was being reassigned, but from the committee entirely. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. And did she provide a reason? She said that she'd heard, that people had expressed concerns, that there were questions about my suitability. Miss Price's voice was carefully controlled, but her hands were clasped tightly together. When I asked what concerns, specifically, she said that it wasn't anything she could quite put into words, simply a general feeling that perhaps I wasn't quite the right fit for that sort of work. She assured me it was nothing personal, that she had only the kindest feelings toward me, but that sometimes one had to make difficult decisions for the good of the organisation. Miss Marple noted the precision with which Miss Price recounted this conversation, the way she held on to each word as though examining it for hidden meanings. And you believe this relates to the anonymous letter? Miss Price stopped walking and turned to face her. I don't know what else it could relate to, Miss Marple. I've done nothing wrong. My work has always been satisfactory. More than satisfactory, I thought. I keep accurate records. I attend every meeting. I've never shirked a responsibility. Yet suddenly, without any specific cause, I'm being removed. And when I try to understand why, I'm met with vague assurances that it's all for the best. How very trying for you. What's worse is that I can't defend myself against accusations that are never quite made. If someone said I'd embezzled funds or falsified minutes, I could prove otherwise. But how does one prove one's suitability when the charge is simply that one lacks it? How does one counter a general feeling? It was, Miss Marple reflected, an excellent question. The genius of such tactics lay precisely in their immunity to rebuttal. Have you spoken with anyone else about this? She asked. What could I say? That I suspect people are talking about me without making specific accusations? That I feel I'm being judged unfairly on grounds that remain unstated? I'd sound either paranoid or self-pitying. Miss Price's voice carried a bitter edge. Mrs. Avery has made it all seem so reasonable, you see. She speaks of my welfare, of not wanting me to feel burdened by responsibilities that might prove taxing. She suggests that I'll be happier with fewer obligations. It's all couched in such concern that to object would appear ungracious. They had reached a small wooden bench that overlooked the village green, and Miss Marple suggested they sit for a moment. The morning sun was pleasant, and the view afforded them a clear perspective of the high street and its various establishments. Tell me, Miss Marple said after a pause, did Mrs. Avery mention the letter? Did she indicate that she knew of its existence? She mentioned it obliquely. She said that sometimes unkind people spread rumours, and that while she herself never credited such things, one had to be mindful of community sensibilities. She said the letter, she didn't call it that exactly, but it was clear what she meant, was obviously malicious, but that even malicious statements could create unfortunate impressions that needed to be managed. Managed, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yes. She said that by removing me from visible positions, she was actually protecting me from further speculation, that it was kinder to let matters settle quietly than to keep me in circumstances where I might be subject to gossip. Miss Marple considered this reasoning, which had the curious quality of appearing benevolent while achieving precisely the opposite effect. By removing Miss Price from her positions, Mrs. Avery had essentially confirmed that there was something to be concerned about, something requiring action, even while maintaining that the concerns themselves were baseless. And you believe Mrs. Avery wrote the letter herself, Miss Marple said. It was not a question. Miss Price looked startled, then thoughtful. I hadn't quite articulated it to myself, but yes, I think she did. Or if she didn't write it, she's certainly using it to achieve ends she'd already decided upon. The letter gave her a reason to act on judgments she'd already formed. What judgments might those be? I don't know. Miss Price's voice was weary now. Perhaps she simply doesn't like me. Perhaps I've offended her in some way I'm not aware of. Or perhaps, and this is what troubles me most, perhaps she simply finds it convenient to have someone to exclude, someone whose social position is sufficiently marginal that removing them creates no real opposition. It was a bleak assessment, made more so by its probable accuracy. Authority, Miss Marple observed gently, is rarely aware of its own force. Those who possess it often fail to recognize how little resistance others can offer, and how devastating even small exercises of that power can be. Miss Price rose from the bench, her expression resigned. I suppose I should be grateful it's no worse. I still have my position at the library at least. That's not in Mrs. Avery's gift to remove. My dear, Miss Marple said, rising as well, I think perhaps you should know that you're not the only person whose circumstances seem to concern Mrs. Avery. There are patterns here worth examining. Patterns? Yes. And patterns, I've found, reveal intentions more clearly than any single action can. Miss Marple paused, then added, Would you do me a small favour? If you should recall any other instances where Mrs. Avery has expressed particular concern for someone's welfare, especially concern that resulted in their social diminishment, I should be most interested to hear of it. Miss Price's eyes widened slightly with understanding. You're investigating this. I'm observing, Miss Marple corrected gently. There's a difference, though perhaps not a large one. They parted at the corner, Miss Price returning toward her rooms above the draper's shop, Miss Marple continuing her walk with much to occupy her thoughts. Mrs. Avery had, it seemed, accomplished her immediate objective with Miss Price. The question now was what other objective she might be pursuing, and whom else might be suffering from her well-intentioned concern. Chapter 5. Fear of being spoken of. The village, Miss Marple had long since observed, possessed a collective consciousness that operated with remarkable efficiency. What one person knew in the morning, 3 people discussed at noon, and by evening had become general knowledge requiring no source or confirmation. By the middle of the following week, Miss Price's removal from the Village Welfare Committee had become a fact everyone acknowledged while pretending not to notice. Miss Marple encountered evidence of this phenomenon on Tuesday afternoon, when she called at the draper's shop to collect some embroidery silk. Mrs. Trimble, who had run the establishment for 30 years and knew every detail of village life worth knowing, greeted her with the particular expression of someone bursting with information they were pretending not to possess. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. The silk you ordered came in yesterday. A lovely shade of rose, just as you requested. She produced the skeins with a flourish, then added, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, Such a pity about Miss Price, isn't it? Is it? Miss Marple inquired mildly, examining the silk with apparent absorption. Well, one doesn't like to see anyone excluded, naturally, though I suppose if Mrs. Avery felt it was necessary. Mrs. Trimble's voice trailed off meaningfully. One must assume there were reasons. Mrs. Avery isn't the sort to act without cause. What reasons has she given? Mrs. Trimble looked momentarily uncomfortable. Well, nothing specific, as I understand it. But then sometimes specifics aren't required, are they? When there's a general sense that something isn't quite right, a general feeling. A feeling, Miss Marple repeated. How very substantial. Mrs. Trimble missed the irony entirely. Exactly. Mrs. Avery has such good instincts about people. If she sensed that Miss Price wasn't quite suitable, well, I'm sure she had excellent grounds for it. Better to act early than to wait until something unfortunate occurs. Has Miss Price done something unfortunate? Oh no, nothing like that. At least nothing one could point to exactly. But you know how it is. Sometimes one simply knows that a person isn't quite reliable, even if one can't say precisely why. Single women in her position can be so difficult to place, socially speaking. Too much responsibility, and they might become presumptuous. Better to keep them to situations they can manage comfortably. Miss Marple accepted her silk and departed. reflecting on how neatly Mrs. Trimble had articulated the circular reasoning that now surrounded Miss Price. She was unsuitable because Mrs. Avery had deemed her so, and Mrs. Avery's judgment was sound because she was Mrs. Avery. The lack of specific charges had ceased to matter. The act of exclusion itself had become the evidence of its own necessity. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. Nothing formal, simply the vicar's wife's monthly "at home" for a select group of village ladies. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was a sensible woman who took her social duties seriously without taking herself too seriously, and her gatherings were generally pleasant affairs marked by good tea and better conversation. On this occasion, however, the conversation took a turn that Miss Marple found both revealing and disturbing. Mrs. Avery was present, as she usually was at such gatherings, and held forth with her customary assurance on various village matters. When the subject of the Christmas charity drive arose, she mentioned with an air of regret that the committee structure had required some adjustment. One must always be mindful, she said, of placing people in positions that suit their capacities. It's unkind, really, to expect too much of those who aren't quite equipped for broader responsibilities. Miss Price is perfectly adequate for library work, following established procedures, you understand. But committee work requires a certain social confidence that not everyone possesses. Has Miss Price proved inadequate in some way? Asked Mrs. Clement, who had a habit of asking direct questions that other people preferred to leave unvoiced. Oh, nothing overt, Mrs. Avery assured her. Simply a matter of suitability. One observes patterns over time, small hesitations, minor uncertainties, a tendency to be overly sensitive to criticism. Better to recognise such limitations early and adjust responsibilities accordingly. I've always found Miss Price most competent, Mrs. Clement said thoughtfully. She manages the library admirably, and her minutes were always scrupulously accurate. Accuracy in transcription isn't quite the same as judgment in execution, Mrs. Avery replied with a smile that managed to be both kind and dismissive. I'm sure you understand, my dear Mrs. Clement. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do is to spare someone the embarrassment of being placed in situations beyond their natural scope. Mr. Finch, who had been invited along with his wife and had been sitting quietly in a corner with his teacup, chose this moment to contribute his professional perspective. Mrs. Avery is quite right, he said in his measured way. In my practice, I've often seen how removal from certain positions can actually protect individuals from gossip and speculation. If there are questions about someone's suitability, even unfounded questions, continuing to place them in visible roles simply invites further talk. Better to quietly adjust their circumstances and allow matters to settle. But surely, Miss Marple said gently, removing someone from a position in response to unfounded questions gives those questions a substance they didn't previously possess. It suggests there was something to be concerned about after all. Mr. Finch frowned slightly. One must balance various considerations, Miss Marple. The individual's welfare, the organisation's effectiveness, the community's confidence. Sometimes a small sacrifice of position prevents a larger damage to reputation. Whose reputation? Miss Marple inquired. The person removed, or the organisation doing the removing? There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Avery broke it with a light laugh. Dear Miss Marple, you do ask the most penetrating questions, but surely you see that we're all working toward the same end. A harmonious community where everyone finds their appropriate place. Some people flourish in prominent roles, others in quieter ones. There's no shame in recognising which is which. No shame in the recognition, Miss Marple agreed. Only perhaps in the assumption that we're qualified to make such determinations for others. The conversation moved on to safer topics after that, but Miss Marple noted how neatly the framework had been established. Miss Price's removal was presented as protection from gossip, from responsibilities beyond her capacity, from the embarrassment of being found wanting. That the removal itself created the very gossip and embarrassment it purported to prevent was a contradiction no one seemed inclined to examine. Walking home through the November darkness, Miss Marple reflected on how fear operated in small communities. Not the fear of actual wrongdoing, which could be investigated and either confirmed or disproved, but the fear of being spoken of becoming the subject of speculation, of losing the protective colouring of ordinariness. That fear, she recognised, was what made Mrs. Avery's tactics so effective. By suggesting that removal was protection, she enlisted the victim's own anxiety as an accomplice. Who would resist being protected? Who would insist on remaining visible when invisibility was offered as a kindness? It was, Miss Marple thought, quite brilliantly cruel, and it would continue to be effective until someone was willing to examine what, precisely, Miss Price needed protection from, and whether that protection served her interests or someone else's entirely. She let herself into her cottage, hung up her coat and settled by the fire with her knitting. The pattern was becoming clearer now, though several pieces remained elusive. Mrs. Avery controlled reputations through judicious suggestions of unsuitability, always framed as concern, always effective because impossible to refute. But why Miss Price specifically? And what role did Mrs. Rowley play in this carefully constructed drama? Those questions, Miss Marple suspected, would require a deeper understanding of past events, of what had been quietly managed before, and what debts of gratitude might bind people to silence now. Dear me, she murmured to herself, her needles clicking steadily in the quiet room. How very thoroughly one can be trapped by kindness. Chapter 6. The Protection of Appearances. Miss Marple had found over the years that the most illuminating conversations often occurred in the most ordinary circumstances. It was while sheltering from a sudden shower in the church porch on Wednesday afternoon that she learned something significant about Mrs. Rowley's past. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had been arranging flowers for the Sunday service when the rain began. She emerged from the church proper to find Miss Marple shaking out her umbrella and settling on the stone bench to wait out the downpour. "How fortuitous," Mrs. Clement said warmly. "I've been meaning to have a word with you, Miss Marple, and here we are with a perfect excuse for a quiet chat." "Indeed, though I confess I should have checked the sky more carefully before setting out." Mrs. Clement seated herself with a small sigh. She was one of those forthright, practical women who managed a vicar's household with competence and a certain impatience for unnecessary complications. Miss Marple had always found her refreshingly direct. "I've been troubled," Mrs. Clement said without preamble, "by what's happening with Miss Price. It seems to me that she's being treated rather shabbily, though everyone is being so very polite about it that objecting feels churlish." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Politeness can be an effective shield for a great many actions." "Exactly so. And what troubles me particularly is that I've seen this pattern before, about 3 years ago, involving Mrs. Rowley. I wasn't certain whether to mention it, but given current circumstances, I think perhaps you should know." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled in her lap. "Please, go on." Mrs. Clement gazed out at the rain, gathering her thoughts. It was shortly after Mrs. Rowley was widowed. She was in rather desperate straits financially. Her husband had left debts she hadn't known about, and she had no family to fall back on. She needed employment, but of course her situation was delicate. Widows of a certain class aren't quite servants, but can't quite afford to be ladies of leisure either. A difficult position, Miss Marple observed. Very much so. Mrs. Rowley was taking in sewing work, but she needed more reliable income. There was a position available as companion to old Mrs. Fenton. Do you remember her? She died 2 years ago, quite peacefully. I remember her slightly. A somewhat demanding woman, I believe. Demanding and wealthy, Mrs. Clement confirmed. The position would have solved Mrs. Rowley's financial difficulties entirely. Mrs. Fenton was willing to engage her. The terms were generous, and it seemed settled. Then Mrs. Avery intervened. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating a curtain of sound that made their conversation feel oddly private despite the public setting. What form did this intervention take? Mrs. Avery called on Mrs. Fenton privately. I only know about it because Mrs. Fenton mentioned it to my husband in confidence, though she's beyond being hurt by the telling now. Mrs. Avery suggested that while Mrs. Rowley was undoubtedly respectable, there had been certain irregularities in her late husband's business dealings. Nothing criminal, she was careful to emphasize, but perhaps indicative of a certain laxness in judgment, a tendency to overlook proprieties that might extend to other areas of life. Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. Were there such irregularities? Mr. Rowley had taken out rather more credit than was wise, and when he died suddenly, some of his business arrangements were discovered to be somewhat optimistic in their accounting. Nothing dishonest exactly, but not quite what his creditors had been led to expect. It was embarrassing more than anything else, and Mrs. Rowley herself had known nothing about it until after his death. Yet Mrs. Avery used this to prevent her employment. Not prevent exactly. That's what made it so clever. She simply planted doubt. She told Mrs. Fenton that she felt obligated to mention these concerns, purely out of a sense of duty, while assuring her that the decision was entirely Mrs. Fenton's to make. But the effect was predictable. Mrs. Fenton withdrew her offer. Who would want to engage a companion if there were questions about her judgment? How did Mrs. Rowley manage after that? Mrs. Clement's expression grew troubled. That's where it becomes more complicated. Within a week, Mrs. Avery offered Mrs. Rowley sewing work from her own household, regular employment, reasonably paid, though nothing like the companion position would have been. She presented it as charity, as helping a neighbour in need. Mrs. Rowley accepted naturally. She had little choice. And was grateful, presumably. Enormously grateful. She still speaks of Mrs. Avery's kindness with genuine emotion. She has no idea that Mrs. Avery was the reason she lost the better position in the first place. Mrs. Clement paused, then added quietly, "I've always wondered if that was intentional, creating the need in order to be seen as fulfilling it." Miss Marple considered this carefully constructed scenario. Mrs. Avery had damaged Mrs. Rowley's prospects, then offered a lesser solution, thereby establishing both gratitude and dependence. Mrs. Rowley now owed her position to Mrs. Avery's benevolence, and would be unlikely to question or oppose her in any matter. "Did you ever consider telling Mrs. Rowley the truth?" "I considered it," Mrs. Clement admitted, "but what purpose would it serve? The damage was done, she needs the work she has, and learning that her benefactor was also her saboteur would only cause pain without providing remedy. Sometimes, Miss Marple, knowing the truth is worse than living with a comfortable illusion." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "though I've found that comfortable illusions have a way of exacting their own costs." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the rain begin to ease. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly, connecting what she had just learned to what she already knew. Mrs. Avery had a history of managing situations to her advantage, suppressing information that might benefit others, then offering help that ensured gratitude and control. She had done it with Mrs. Rowley 3 years ago, and she was doing it with Miss Price now. The pattern was clear. But what had prompted the anonymous letter? If Mrs. Avery wanted to guide opinion about Miss Price, why draw attention to the process by writing to Miss Marple? Unless, of course, that was precisely the point. "Tell me," Miss Marple said carefully, "did anyone else know about Mrs. Avery's role in Mrs. Rowley losing the companion position?" "I don't believe so. Mrs. Fenton mentioned it to my husband in the strictest confidence, and he only told me because he was troubled by it. I've never spoken of it to anyone until now." "And yet," Miss Marple mused, "someone wrote me a letter suggesting that respected households were shielding improper conduct, that protection was being extended to those who didn't deserve it. What if that letter wasn't meant to expose actual wrongdoing, but rather to invite me to investigate, to lend my authority to conclusions already reached?" Mrs. Clement looked puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Mrs. Avery wrote that letter herself," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. "She wanted me to observe, to draw conclusions, and presumably to voice those conclusions in a way that would give them weight. She knows my reputation for discretion and judgment. If I were to suggest that Miss Price was unsuitable, others would credit it. She was attempting to enlist me as an unwitting accomplice in her management of village opinion." "Good heavens," Mrs. Clement breathed. "But surely," Why would she need your endorsement? She seems perfectly capable of achieving her ends without it." "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "even those who exercise power prefer to have it validated by those they respect. And because perhaps there was some resistance she anticipated, some voice that might question her judgment, and my agreement would have preempted that resistance." The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the churchyard fresh and glistening. Miss Marple rose, folding her knitting with practised efficiency. "Thank you, Mrs. Clement. You've helped me understand something important. The letter was never about revealing truth. It was about shaping perception. Mrs. Avery wanted to guide my attention, to have me see what she wanted seen, and draw the conclusions she had already determined were correct." "What will you do?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but carried a quality of steel beneath its kindness. "I shall continue to observe, my dear, and I shall draw my own conclusions, not the ones I was meant to draw. That, I suspect, will prove most illuminating for everyone involved." She departed, leaving Mrs. Clement in the church porch with much to think about, while Miss Marple herself walked home through the damp November air, with the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to form a coherent picture. Chapter 7. Harm Done Quietly. Understanding the mechanism of a deception, Miss Marple reflected, was not quite the same as understanding its full extent. Over the next several days, she found herself reconsidering past events with a new clarity that was both illuminating and troubling. She had invited Miss Price to tea on Friday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the library's Christmas book display, but in truth to pursue certain lines of inquiry that had occupied her thoughts since her conversation with Mrs. Clement. Miss Price arrived promptly, looking thinner and more tired than she had even a week earlier. "How kind of you to invite me," Miss Price said, accepting a cup of tea with hands that were not quite steady. "I confess I've been rather short of pleasant company lately. People seem to have become very busy all at once." "Have they indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, offering the plate of biscuits. "Tell me, my dear, how long have you lived in St. Mary Mead?" 15 years this past September. I came here when I was 27, fresh from looking after my mother through her final illness. The library position was advertised, and it seemed a good opportunity for a new start." "And were you made welcome?" Miss Price considered this carefully. "At first, yes, or at least I was treated with polite interest. But I've noticed over the years that certain opportunities never quite materialized. Committee positions that seemed promising would be filled by someone else. Social invitations would be extended to others, but not to me. Nothing dramatic, you understand, simply a gradual diminishment of possibility." "Can you recall when this pattern began?" "I believe it was about 12 years ago. I'd been here 3 years and was finally beginning to feel settled. Mrs. Avery had just moved to the Larches. She'd been living in London before that, I believe. She took an active interest in village organisations almost immediately. Very capable, very certain of how things should be arranged." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "And did she take an active interest in you?" "She was quite kind initially. She asked about my work, my background, my circumstances. I was flattered by the attention, actually. I thought perhaps she might become a friend." Miss Price's smile was bitter. "Then one day, I overheard her speaking to someone, I don't even remember whom, about the need to be careful with single women in precarious positions. She said they could become over-attached to any kindness shown them, could mistake professional courtesy for personal regard. It was said quite generally, but I realized she was speaking about me. And after that, the distance grew. Nothing overt, but I was never quite included in the more intimate gatherings. I was suitable for public committees, but not for private dinners, useful for routine tasks, but not for those requiring trust or discretion." Miss Marple felt a surge of anger on behalf of this quiet, conscientious woman who'd spent 12 years being systematically marginalised. Did Mrs. Avery ever state a reason for these distinctions? She didn't need to state reasons. She simply created an atmosphere of vague unsuitability around me. A word here, a meaningful pause there, a tendency to redirect conversations when I contributed to them. Over time, others absorbed her assessment without necessarily understanding where it came from. I became someone to be kind to, certainly, but not someone to be taken seriously. Yet you continued with your library work, your committee responsibilities. What choice did I have? I needed the income, and the work itself was satisfying. I told myself that perhaps Mrs. Avery was right, that I was too sensitive, that I imagined slights that didn't exist. It's remarkable how thoroughly one can be convinced of one's own inadequacy by constant gentle suggestion. Miss Marple refilled their teacups, her mind working through the implications of what she was hearing. Mrs. Avery's influence had been more pervasive and more sustained than she had initially realized. This was not a single act of manipulation, but a long campaign of quiet diminishment. "Tell me something," Miss Marple said. "Are there others in the village whom Mrs. Avery has treated similarly? Others who have been redirected away from opportunities, or whose reputations have been subtly managed?" Miss Price thought for a moment. Young Mrs. Henderson, who works at the post office, was once quite active in village affairs. About 2 years ago, she became noticeably less visible. I remember Mrs. Avery mentioning something about her being rather forward in her opinions. Nothing specific, just a general sense that perhaps she needed to be encouraged toward more modest ambitions. And Mrs. Henderson's response? She withdrew. She still works at the post office, but she no longer volunteers for committees or attends social gatherings beyond what's strictly necessary. Anyone else? Mr. Carey, who teaches at the village school, he proposed some changes to the curriculum several years ago. Nothing radical, simply modernizing certain approaches. Mrs. Avery served on the school board at the time. She expressed concerns about his judgment, his tendency to be overly influenced by fashionable theories. The proposals were rejected, and Mr. Carey has been notably cautious ever since. A pattern indeed, Miss Marple thought. Mrs. Avery had spent years identifying anyone who might challenge her authority, or who might be vulnerable to social pressure, and had systematically ensured their compliance or their irrelevance. She had done it so gradually, so carefully, that no single action appeared significant. It was only when viewed as a whole that the architecture of control became visible. "Miss Price," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe Mrs. Avery wrote that anonymous letter herself. I believe she wrote it to enlist my support in a process she had already set in motion. Your removal from positions where you might have influence or visibility." Miss Price looked startled, then thoughtful. "But why go to such lengths? I posed no threat to her. I never challenged her authority or questioned her decisions." "That, I suspect, is precisely the point. You didn't need to challenge her to be perceived as potentially inconvenient. Your independence, such as it was, your competence in your work, your very presence in positions of minor responsibility, all of these represented possibilities that Mrs. Avery preferred to control. By isolating you socially while keeping you economically dependent, she ensured both your harmlessness and your example." "My example?" "Yes. Your gradual diminishment serves as instruction to others about what happens to those who lack Mrs. Avery's approval. It teaches everyone else to seek her favour, to defer to her judgment, to avoid any appearance of independence that might mark them as similarly unsuitable." Miss Price absorbed this in silence, her expression moving through shock, anger, and finally a kind of grim understanding. "It's really quite brilliant," she said at last. "In a horrible way, it's brilliant. She's created a system where everyone polices themselves for fear of becoming what I've become. Socially peripheral, professionally limited, personally isolated. And she's done it all while maintaining a reputation for kindness and community service," Miss Marple added. "That is perhaps the most insidious aspect. Her cruelty hides behind such irreproachable benevolence that exposing it risks appearing vindictive or irrational." They sat together in the gathering darkness, the tea grown cold in their cups, contemplating the architecture of harm done so quietly that it had operated for years without detection. Miss Marple felt the weight of what needed to be done pressing upon her, not merely correcting a single injustice, but revealing a pattern that had damaged multiple lives, while presenting itself as concern for the community's welfare. "What happens now?" Miss Price asked finally. "Now," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but determined, "we consider how best to address a wrong that has been committed without anyone quite realizing it was being committed. That, I'm afraid, requires rather more delicacy than addressing obvious crimes." She showed Miss Price out into the November evening, then returned to her chair by the fire, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap, as she contemplated the question of how one confronted power that operated through kindness, control that masqueraded as care. Chapter 8, The Shape of the Deception. Saturday morning brought a clarity of understanding that often follows a period of careful contemplation. Miss Marple woke with the pieces of the puzzle arranged in her mind, with such perfect coherence that she wondered why she hadn't seen the pattern immediately. The anonymous letter lay in her writing desk drawer where she had placed it for safekeeping. She retrieved it now and read it again with fresh eyes, noting details that had seemed innocuous on first reading but now appeared weighted with calculated intent. "You're known to be a person of understanding and discretion," the letter stated. Not, "you're understanding and discreet," which would suggest the writer knew her personally, but "you are known to be," which suggested someone observing her reputation from a position within the community. There are households held in high regard which perhaps ought not to be regarded quite so highly. This implied the writer had standing sufficient to make such judgments, someone who felt entitled to evaluate which households deserved regard and which did not. Perhaps you might take note of certain circumstances that others choose not to see. The assumption here was that Miss Marple's observations would carry weight, that her conclusions would influence others. The writer wanted not merely to inform, but to direct attention in a way that would shape community opinion. Mrs. Avery had written this letter. Miss Marple was now absolutely certain of it. What remained was to understand the precise nature of what Mrs. Avery had hoped to achieve. She was still considering this when her doorbell rang. To her considerable surprise, her caller was Mrs. Rowley, who stood on the doorstep looking anxious and clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I've brought the alterations you requested, the hem on your grey skirt. Mrs. Avery gave me the work, you see, and I wanted to return it promptly." "How thoughtful. Do come in for a moment, Mrs. Rowley. I've just put the kettle on." Mrs. Rowley hesitated, then accepted, following Miss Marple into the sitting room with the nervous manner of someone unused to social calls. She perched on the edge of the sofa, declining tea but accepting a glass of water. "I hope the work is satisfactory," she said, unwrapping the parcel to reveal the carefully hemmed skirt. "I've tried to match the original stitching exactly. I'm certain it's perfect. You do beautiful work, Mrs. Rowley. Tell me, how long have you been doing sewing for Mrs. Avery?" "Nearly 3 years now. She's been so kind, providing me with regular employment when I was quite desperate. I don't know what I would have done without her generosity." Miss Marple examined the hem with appropriate attention, then said casually, "It must have been difficult after your husband died. I understand the circumstances were rather trying." Mrs. Rowley's face clouded. "Very trying. Robert had made certain business arrangements that proved unfortunate. Nothing dishonest, you understand, but the debts were considerable. I knew nothing about any of it until after he was gone. That must have been shocking." "It was mortifying," Mrs. Rowley said quietly. "In a village like this, one's reputation is everything. I was terrified that people would think I'd been complicit in his poor judgment, that I'd known and said nothing. When the companion position with Mrs. Fenton fell through, I thought it was because of the scandal." Miss Marple's hand stilled on the skirt. "Did Mrs. Avery discuss that position with you?" "Oh, yes. She was very sympathetic. She said that unfortunately, once doubts had been raised about one's judgment, even unfairly, it became difficult to secure positions of trust. She said Mrs. Fenton had heard rumours and become concerned. But then, only days later, Mrs. Avery offered me sewing work from her own household. She said she didn't credit the gossip herself, that she believed in giving people opportunities to rebuild their reputations through reliable service. The architecture of it, Miss Marple thought, was really quite elegant. Mrs. Avery had destroyed the opportunity, then positioned herself as the rescuer, ensuring both gratitude and a perpetual reminder of debt. "Mrs. Rawley," Miss Marple said gently, "has Mrs. Avery ever asked you to speak about other people in the village? To share your impressions or concerns about their character?" Mrs. Rowley looked uncomfortable. "She sometimes asks my opinion, yes. She says that people in my position often see things that others miss, that we observe household details, hear conversations, notice small inconsistencies." "And have you shared such observations?" "Sometimes, only when specifically asked, and only about people who seemed as though they might not be quite reliable. Mrs. Avery says it's important to be alert to potential problems, to protect the community from those who might take advantage." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. Mrs. Avery had not merely managed reputations herself. She had recruited others to do the observing for her, creating a network of informal surveillance masked as community concern. Mrs. Rowley, grateful for her employment and dependent on Mrs. Avery's continued favour, had become an unwitting instrument of the very system that had harmed her. "Has she asked about Miss Price recently?" Mrs. Rowley hesitated, then nodded. "She mentioned that there had been concerns about Miss Price's suitability for committee work. She asked if I'd noticed anything in my interactions at the library, whether Miss Price seemed distracted, or careless, or overly emotional. I couldn't think of anything specific, but Mrs. Avery said that sometimes the absence of obvious problems was itself a kind of problem, a surface composure that might hide deeper instabilities." It was brilliant in its circularity, Miss Marple realised. Any evidence supported the conclusion, and the absence of evidence supported it equally well. The deception lay not in fabricating falsehoods, but in selecting which truths to emphasise and which to suppress, in framing observations in ways that guided interpretation toward predetermined conclusions. Mrs. Avery had written the letter to Miss Marple not to expose wrongdoing, but to enlist her as a validator of judgments already made. She had assumed, quite reasonably from her perspective, that Miss Marple would investigate, would observe the same patterns of unsuitability that Mrs. Avery had so carefully cultivated, and would then lend her considerable moral authority to the consensus that Miss Price should be quietly marginalised. What Mrs. Avery had not anticipated was that Miss Marple might investigate the investigator herself, might question not merely the conclusions but the process by which those conclusions had been reached, and the interests they served. Mrs. Rowley departed shortly after, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and the anonymous letter that now appeared less as a revelation than as an invitation to participate in a deception so subtle that most participants never recognised it as such. The question now was how to address it. Simply revealing Mrs. Avery's authorship would accomplish little. She would deny it, and without proof the accusation would seem vindictive. Exposing her methods would require demonstrating a pattern that most villagers had experienced as individual kindnesses rather than systematic control. What was needed was not accusation, but illumination, a way to help people see what they had been looking at, all along without quite recognising it for what it was. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and settled by the window, her needles moving with practised rhythm, while her mind pursued the question of how one revealed a deception that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very benevolence it used as camouflage. Chapter 9, the matter explained calmly. Sunday afternoon found Miss Marple walking purposefully toward the larches, the anonymous letter folded in her handbag. The day was overcast but dry, with that particular quality of November light that made everything appear subdued and slightly melancholy. She had considered various approaches to this conversation, and had concluded that directness, tempered with courtesy, would serve best. Mrs. Avery was not a foolish woman, nor was she deliberately malicious in the ordinary sense of the word. She was rather someone who had mistaken control for care, and had never been confronted with the consequences of that mistake. Mrs. Avery herself answered the door, dressed for an afternoon at home in a well-tailored wool dress of deep blue. Her expression registered mild surprise, but perfect politeness. "Miss Marple, how unexpected. Do come in, I was just about to have tea. Will you join me?" "Thank you, Mrs. Avery, that would be most welcome." The drawing room was as immaculate as always, the tea service already laid out with the precision that characterized all of Mrs. Avery's domestic arrangements. They settled into their chairs with the ritualized courtesy of English women who understood that serious conversations required proper staging. "I hope you're keeping well," Mrs. Avery said, pouring tea with practiced ease. "I trust there have been no further unpleasant surprises, no more anonymous letters." It was said with apparent concern, but Miss Marple detected a note of inquiry beneath the sympathy, a desire to know whether the letter had achieved its intended effect. "Only the one," Miss Marple replied, accepting her cup, "though I confess it has occupied my thoughts considerably this past week. How distressing. Such letters are always meant to create trouble, aren't they? To plant seeds of doubt where none should exist." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "though I've come to believe that this particular letter was meant to achieve something rather different. I wonder if I might share my conclusions with you." Mrs. Avery's expression remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or calculation. "Of course! I'm always interested in your insights, Miss Marple. Your judgment is so very sound." "That's kind of you to say, though I must confess that my judgment in this instance leads me to conclusions you may find uncomfortable." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I believe you wrote that letter yourself, Mrs. Avery." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Avery's face remained perfectly still, but her hands tightened slightly on the handle of the teapot. "That's a rather extraordinary accusation," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I think if you consider it honestly, you'll find it simply an observation. The letter was written by someone who knew me by reputation, who understood the weight my opinions might carry, and who hoped to enlist my support in managing a situation they had already determined required management. The phrasing suggested education and social standing. The content revealed intimate knowledge of village dynamics. Most tellingly, it revealed more about its author than about any supposed wrongdoing." Mrs. Avery said nothing, but her silence was eloquent. "You wanted me to observe Miss Price," Miss Marple continued, "to notice what you had already decided I should notice, that she was unsuitable for positions of responsibility. You hoped that if I reached that conclusion independently, it would validate your own judgment and provide additional authority for her exclusion. It was, in its way, quite a compliment to my reputation. And if I were to suggest," Mrs. Avery said slowly, "that your conclusion is mistaken, then I would remind you that I've spent the past week observing not merely Miss Price, but the entire pattern of relationships in this village. I've learned about Mrs. Rowley's lost opportunity with Mrs. Fenton. I've heard about Mrs. Henderson's withdrawal from village affairs and Mr. Carey's new caution in his teaching. I've seen how you've created a system whereby your judgments become communal judgments, without anyone quite realizing the process by which that occurs." Mrs. Avery's composure cracked slightly. "I have always acted in the best interests of this community. Everything I've done has been to protect people from their own limitations, to ensure that the village functions smoothly and harmoniously." "Protection," Miss Marple echoed. "Yes, you've used that word frequently. But I wonder whether you've considered what exactly you've been protecting, and whom you've been protecting it for?" "I don't understand what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said, her voice remaining gentle but carrying an edge of firmness. "You've been protecting your own sense of order, your own comfort in having things arranged as you believe they should be. And you've done it by managing other people's reputations and opportunities, by deciding on their behalf what roles they're suited for and what aspirations they're permitted to hold." Mrs. Avery rose from her chair and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of defensive justification. Someone must make such decisions. Communities require leadership, require judgment. If people are placed in positions beyond their capacities, they fail and everyone suffers. I've simply tried to ensure that doesn't happen. by suppressing Mrs. Rowley's employment opportunity and then offering her lesser work, by gradually isolating Miss Price from any position where she might exercise independent judgment, by teaching everyone else that their social standing depends on maintaining your favour. You make it sound so calculated, Mrs. Avery said, turning to face her. It wasn't like that. Or rather, it wasn't meant to be cruel. I genuinely believed I was helping. I don't doubt your belief, Miss Marple said quietly. But belief in one's benevolence is not the same as actual benevolence. The real wrong, Mrs. Avery, is not scandal or impropriety, or any of the things your letter suggested might exist. The real wrong is the assumption that one person may decide who deserves protection and who doesn't, who merits opportunity and who should be quietly limited. Mrs. Avery returned to her chair, her composure visibly shaken. What do you want me to do? Apologize to the entire village? Admit that I've been, what? Managing them? Controlling them? I want you to recognize what you've done, Miss Marple said simply. Not to others. They will reach their own understandings in time, but to yourself. To acknowledge that your certainty about how things should be arranged has caused real harm to real people, however kind your intentions may have seemed. And if I refuse this acknowledgement? Miss Marple's expression carried both sympathy and resolve. Then I will be forced to have similar conversations with others in the village. Mrs. Clement already knows about Mrs. Rowley. Miss Price understands her own situation. It would not be difficult to help people see the pattern you've created, but I would much prefer that such revelation came from your own recognition, rather than my intervention. Mrs. Avery sat in silence for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her face reflecting an internal struggle between self-justification and genuine understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost fragile. I thought I was making things better. I thought communities needed someone to ensure order, to protect standards. My own mother always said that women of position had a responsibility to guide those less fortunate or less capable. Position, Miss Marple said gently, is not the same as wisdom, and responsibility is not the same as authority over others' lives. True community care means trusting people to find their own places, supporting them when they struggle, not deciding in advance what they're capable of achieving. Mrs. Avery looked suddenly older, the confidence that had always characterized her manner replaced by something more uncertain and more human. I don't know how to undo what I've done. Begin, Miss Marple suggested, by stepping back, by allowing Miss Price to resume her responsibilities without commentary or management, by acknowledging, privately, if you prefer, but sincerely, that you've exercised judgment that wasn't yours to exercise. Humility, Mrs. Avery, is the only true safeguard against the misuse of power. Humility, Mrs. Avery repeated softly. Yes, I suppose it is. She looked directly at Miss Marple for the first time since the conversation had begun its difficult turn. You won't make this public? The letter, my methods? I see no purpose in public exposure, Miss Marple said. The goal is not humiliation, but correction. If you can recognize what you've done and choose a different path forward, that will serve everyone far better than scandal. Mrs. Avery nodded slowly, the gesture carrying both relief and a kind of exhausted acceptance. Thank you for that mercy, at least. Miss Marple rose to leave, gathering her handbag and gloves. It isn't mercy, Mrs. Avery. It's simply the recognition that we all require grace when we discover we've been mistaken about ourselves. The question is what we do with that discovery. She left Mrs. Avery sitting in her immaculate drawing room, surrounded by her perfect arrangements, contemplating for perhaps the first time the difference between order imposed and harmony achieved. Chapter 10, After the Letter is Burned. The following week brought changes to St. Mary Mead that were notable precisely because they occurred without explanation or announcement. Those who watched closely, and Miss Marple was certainly among that number, observed a subtle recalibration of social arrangements, as though the village were adjusting to a new equilibrium, without quite acknowledging that the old one had been disrupted. Miss Price appeared at the next Village Welfare Committee meeting, her position as secretary restored without comment. Mrs. Avery presided as always, but her manner had lost some of its former certainty. She consulted more, directed less, and when Miss Price offered a suggestion about the Christmas hamper distribution, Mrs. Avery considered it thoughtfully rather than redirecting the conversation. Mrs. Rowley, whom Miss Marple encountered at the draper's shop on Thursday morning, carried herself differently, less apologetically, with shoulders that no longer seemed perpetually hunched against anticipated criticism. She was discussing fabric choices for the church Christmas pageant costumes with Mrs. Trimble, and her opinions were offered with quiet confidence rather than anxious deference. "I think the green velvet would be more suitable than the blue," Mrs. Rowley was saying. "It drapes better, and the colour will show up nicely against the altar decorations." "You're quite right," Mrs. Trimble agreed. "I hadn't considered the backdrop. Green velvet it is, then." Such a small thing, Miss Marple reflected, yet significant. Mrs. Rowley was no longer waiting for permission to have opinions. On Friday afternoon, Miss Marple received a brief note from Mrs. Avery, written in her characteristic precise hand. "Dear Miss Marple, I write to inform you that I have decided to step down from my position as chair of the Village Welfare Committee at the end of this term. I feel that it is time for fresh perspectives and new leadership. I shall, of course, continue to support the committee's work in whatever capacity proves useful. I have also concluded that certain other roles might benefit from my reduced involvement. One learns, in time, the value of restraint. The matter we discussed has been addressed as you suggested. I trust no further action will be necessary. With regards, Constance Avery." Miss Marple folded the note and placed it in her writing desk beside the anonymous letter, which she had not yet destroyed. Both documents seemed to her to represent a kind of conclusion, one the expression of misguided certainty, the other the acknowledgement of its correction. That evening she invited Mrs. Dolly Bantry for dinner, a small informal affair with cold chicken and a decent wine, followed by coffee in the sitting room where a fire burned cheerfully against the November chill. Mrs. Bantry, who had been Miss Marple's friend for more years than either cared to count, settled into her chair with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. She was a woman who combined considerable shrewdness with an appearance of cheerful vagueness, and she had a talent for drawing out information while appearing to be making idle conversation. "You've been rather preoccupied this past fortnight, Jane," she observed, accepting her coffee. "I've seen that particular expression before. It usually means you've been solving something." "Have I been transparent?" "Only to those who know you well. What was it this time? Not murder, I hope? We've had quite enough of that sort of excitement over the years." "Not murder," Miss Marple assured her. "Something rather more subtle and in its way more insidious. A matter of social control disguised as community care." She recounted the story of the anonymous letter, Mrs. Avery's long pattern of managing reputations, Miss Price's systematic exclusion, and Mrs. Rowley's unknowing complicity in the very system that had harmed her. Mrs. Bantry listened with the focused attention she brought to genuinely interesting problems. "Good heavens," she said when Miss Marple had finished, "and Mrs. Avery actually wrote the letter herself to enlist your support. That's rather audacious." Or rather confident in her own judgment, she genuinely believed she was acting for the good of the community. That's what made it so difficult to address. One can confront malice, but benevolent certainty is far more challenging. "What did you do with the letter? The physical thing, I mean." Miss Marple rose and retrieved both the anonymous letter and Mrs. Avery's note from her desk. "I thought I might burn them both, actually, with you as witness, so there's no question of my keeping hold of them for leverage. Very wise, though I confess I'm curious to see this famous letter first." Miss Marple handed it to her, and Mrs. Bantry read it with growing understanding. "It's extraordinarily clever, isn't it? It accuses no one of anything specific, yet it invites the most damaging kind of speculation. And by addressing it to you, she was essentially asking you to validate her own conclusions." "Precisely. She assumed I would observe what she had carefully arranged for me to observe, and that my reputation for sound judgment would give weight to her management of Miss Price's social position." "But you observed the arranger instead of the arrangement. One learns, eventually, to look at who benefits from a particular interpretation of events. In this case, Mrs. Avery benefited from maintaining a system where her judgments went unchallenged, because they appeared to be communal judgments rather than personal ones. Mrs. Bantry handed back the letter. And now? Now she stepped back from several positions of authority and appears to be reconsidering her approach to community involvement. Whether the change will be lasting, I cannot say, but at least she's been made aware that power, even when exercised with apparent kindness, requires accountability. Miss Marple placed both letters in the fire, and they watched as the flames consumed them. The anonymous accusation and the formal acknowledgement both reduced to ash and smoke. "You know what troubles me most about this whole business?" Mrs. Bantry said after a moment. "It's that Mrs. Avery probably will continue to think of herself as a kind person, as someone who was trying to help. She'll have learned to be more cautious, perhaps, but I wonder if she'll truly understand what she did wrong." "Perhaps not entirely," Miss Marple admitted, "but she's learned that her certainty was not infallible, and that's something. Perfect understanding may be beyond most of us, but a degree of humility is within everyone's reach if they're willing to grasp it. That's very generous of you, considering the harm she caused. Generosity has nothing to do with it. I simply recognise that we're all capable of mistaking control for care, of believing our interventions are helpful when they're actually harmful. Mrs. Avery's error was one of scale and persistence, not one of kind. Any of us might fall into similar patterns if we're not vigilant." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Mrs. Bantry said, "What will you tell people if they ask about the letter? About what happened?" "Nothing," Miss Marple replied. "The matter has been resolved privately as it should be. The village will notice the changes, Miss Price's restoration, Mrs. Rowley's greater confidence, Mrs. Avery's reduced involvement, and will draw whatever conclusions seem appropriate. Truth has a way of making itself known without requiring dramatic revelation. You're very wise, Jane." "Not wise, simply old enough to have observed that public exposure often does more harm than private correction. Mrs. Avery has been made to understand her error. Miss Price has been restored to her position. Mrs. Rowley has been freed from her anxious gratitude. Those outcomes matter far more than any satisfaction I might derive from public vindication." Later, after Mrs. Bantry had departed and Miss Marple was preparing for bed, she stood at her window looking out at the village street below. St. Mary Mead appeared peaceful in the November darkness, its certainties intact, its routines undisturbed. Yet something had shifted, a small correction in the village's social mechanics that might prevent similar patterns from developing in future. She thought of Mrs. Avery in her immaculate house, perhaps lying awake considering the difference between managing people and trusting them. She thought of Miss Price in her rooms above the draper's shop, perhaps sleeping more soundly now that the weight of unexplained exclusion had been lifted. She thought of Mrs. Rowley in her cottage near the church, perhaps standing a little straighter tomorrow morning, less concerned about what people might think. "Respectability is most dangerous, my dear," she murmured into the darkness, recalling what she had told Mrs. Bantry earlier, "when it believes itself kind.